Okay. Hi, everyone. We'll get started. I think some more folks are still logging in as we go. But in the interest of time, I just want to get our conversation going because there's such a phenomenal group of panelists here. And I know that there's a lot that we could talk about. And I don't want to miss out on any of the amazing discussion and conversation that I know is sure to follow. Okay, so welcome to everyone. It's such an honor to gather with you all tonight or today, depending on what time zone you're calling in from. I'm an associate professor and chair in law, robotics, and society here at Windsor Law. My name is Kristen Thomason. I'll also be a moderator for this evening. I'm going to briefly introduce our panel and some minor logistics, and then we'll eagerly turn things over to hear from the panelists directly. First, I want to note and recognize that this call is initiated from Windsor. The city and the University of Windsor sit on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi. Where the river bends, or Windsor in Anishinaabemowin, has served as a meeting place for centuries. And I want to recognize this history of this land where we're initiating this call as foundational context for this discussion. Canada, as we now know, is a colonial state, and Windsor, where this call is based from, has connections to both British and French colonization, as well as the longer history of Indigenous life, thriving, and resistance in the region prior to the imposition of the border and the technologies that accompany it. This area of Windsor, Essex, Detroit is also a place where enslaved Black Americans crossed the Detroit River seeking freedom along the Underground Railroad. Yet while Canada promised legal emancipation, true equality has remained elusive. Black refugees faced racism, segregation, and economic barriers that continued to limit opportunities and rights. I'm honored to be joined by these amazing panelists to untangle some of the intersections between the development and sale of technology within Canada and state and imperial violence around the world, including within Canada's own colonial borders. This event was prompted from discussions about how this wider context seemed to be missing in a lot of recent attention that has been focused on Canadian companies' contributions to ICE and the violence being enacted by ICE. The armored vehicle in the event poster is produced by Rochelle, which is a company based in Brampton. We want to build on this attention to ICE and Canada's contributions and expand our perspectives by placing this moment into a wider legal, social, geographical, and historical context. So, to untangle some of these threads, I'm so grateful to be joined by these esteemed experts. Jamie Liu is a full professor at the University of Ottawa and the Shirley Greenberg Chair for Women and the Legal Profession. Her current research examines the meaning of citizenship, legal barriers for stateless persons to obtain citizenship and nationality, gendered implications of Canadian law on migrants, and more. And I strongly encourage audience members to read her books Dandelion and Go Citizens, both brilliant. Jason Toney is the Director of Media Advocacy at Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East and brings extensive experience as a book publisher, editor, and researcher. He's the editor of the book Take the City, Voices of Radical Municipalism, which I came to be familiar with because of his participation in this panel, and it has gone straight to the top of my to-read list. You might also be interested in his recent book, for which he is a co-editor, When Genocide Wasn't News, How Canadian Media Covered Up the Destruction of Gaza. Jeff Doctor is a Cayuga Nation citizen from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. He joins us in his personal capacity, bringing a wealth of knowledge and a decade of experience supporting Indigenous data sovereignty from the ground up. As an impact strategist with Anamiki, Jeff works with Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island to develop web applications and that support their self-determination and digital sovereignty. And James Yap is a Toronto-based lawyer specializing in business and human rights, transnational corporate accountability, and international human rights. He represents plaintiffs in all kinds of human rights and social justice claims, including, for example, the major tort law and human rights case Nevsun. He's president of the Canadian Lawyers for International Human Rights and on the board of directors for the Canadian Council on International Law. My enormous appreciation and thanks to all of you, and also to Roselle Kim and Cynthia Koo, who helped bring this conversation into existence. Cynthia of Technos Law will also moderate our question and answers, and I'm very grateful as well to Windsor Law, Val Curry, and Mita Williams for the time and support to help make this event happen. So we'll hear from the panelists for approximately an hour or so, and then we'll have time at the end for question and answer. You're welcome to type your questions into, there's a little Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You can type those in. Cynthia will bring them forward to the panel and synthesize questions as relevant, in particular in the interest of time. This panel is being recorded and it will be available online later. You can absolutely keep an eye on Windsor Law's website, social media, or my social media if you'd like to see any updates when this and other related resources are shared. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the panel along with some prompting questions. And first, Jason, I'm wondering if you can lay some of the factual foundations for us. So what are we looking at in terms of Canada's contributions to ICE, some of the details on the ground, so to speak?
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I just want to say really quick that I've been living in Montreal for the last 8 years, but I'm actually from the US. So this issue is very important to me, and I feel doubly complicit. And I was raised Catholic. So events like this are part of how I ease my sense of Catholic guilt. So thank you for having me. So to give just sort of a very broad overview of ICE's human rights abuses, I mean, ICE, first of all, has a budget that's the equivalent of like a top 20 military budget for any country in the world. In 2025 alone, 32 people died in ICE custody, and an additional eight were fatally shot by ICE or Border Patrol agents. There's widespread reports of medical neglect in ICE detention, and some of that amounts to torture, according to Amnesty International, in detention centers like Alligator Alcatraz in Florida. And ICE also operates a mass surveillance network that touches the majority of Americans in their everyday lives. So, how does Canadian tech work its way into ICE's operations? There's a few different categories in which that happens. One is the hardware, the physical stuff. You mentioned the poster, the vehicles. There's surveillance technology, whether that's AI or other software. And then there's the logistics and infrastructure, things like deportation flights. And Canada and Canadian business is involved in all of these different aspects. So, according to the Toronto Star, there's about a dozen Canadian companies that have done business with ICE, and many of these contracts are still active right now. Some of the key companies are Thomson Reuters, which provides ICE an investigative database. You have Garda World, which provides security at detention facilities. You have Rochelle, which is the armored personnel carrier manufacturer. Hootsuite provides social media services. And then you have a company called JSI Telecom, which provides different types of surveillance technology. And most of these contracts are tens of millions of dollars for each of these different companies. And Canada's AI minister, Evan Solomon, recently pledged $1 million to JSI, the surveillance tech company that is providing services to ICE. So these companies are, I think, some of the worst offenders that we see covered in the media today. But there are many others, and I'll let the other panelists dig into the other aspects of this. That's just sort of a brief overview.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And Jamie, turning to you, I wonder if you can provide some of that broader context of what is it that ICE is doing and why, and how does this relate to the broader context of immigration, carceral surveillance technologies, and Canada's own experience?
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you to everyone who organized this panel and for the invitation in this important conversation. So I first want to say that, this is, the events that are happening across the border in relation to ICE is not new, and that this is a long-standing practice by states who are trying to maintain a certain kind of nation-building project, which is centered around preserving white settler nations. And so Canada and the US share a history of British colonization. And before, these countries have fully became the United States and Canada, there were uses of the technology that we take for granted today to keep people out of these settler areas and to maintain a predominantly white population. I'll, briefly touch on an example that's not so long ago, which is the Chinese exclusion legislation. This popped up first in the United States, and then Canada followed suit a number of years later. And in trying to manage the movement of Chinese people into the US or Canada, we take for granted now that we use passport photos or photos for identification in our driver's license and other pieces of identification. But this became widespread, massive use during the times when Chinese people were being surveyed and registered in order to not only count, but to ensure that people were being watched and ensured that their behavior could be managed. And so, the things that we take for granted today were experiments in the future. And I just want to say that today we're seeing an increase in the use of experimentation of different kinds of technologies at the borders that we might see in our cities later on. They're confined to the borders now, but the borders are really sites of experimentation. And I recommend reading the work of Petra Molnar and Anthony Lowenstein, who have done quite a bit of work on the laboratory of the border. But having said that, I just want to situate the fact that a lot of people think this is just, an anomalous occasion happening across the border. But that in Canada, we have already seen some violence against racialized and migrant persons. For example, nearly, in 2025, there's about 22,000 people that were moved by Canadian Border Services Agency. That amounts to almost 400 people a week or 57 people a day. This is an increase from 2023, which was around 39 people, 39 persons a day, and much higher than 2022, which only the number of people that were deported were around 8,000. Nevertheless, we see, this tool of deportation to remove people from our borders. The other thing that Canada Border Services Agency engages in is detention of people. And since 2000, at least 19 people have died within CBSA custody. And so, while we should be alarmed with the ways in which people are dying at the hands of ICE, people have died in Canada in relation to CBSA interaction. I also want to say that ICE and CBSA share an enforcement mandate, and the authority to arrest and detain has been a primary tool to control the movement of people, but that this kind of activity is not, there isn't an oversight mechanism. There is in legislation the power to create oversight mechanisms, but there hasn't been, a body created to enact this mandate, and so they're operating virtually without any accountability whatsoever. And so we don't really truly know all of the activities and the violence that has been occurring, and we rely on people to share their stories and share whatever experiences they have. The other thing I want to point out is that Canada does not have a limit on how long people can be detained. And so once someone is in immigration detention, they could be held there for months and even years. And in fact, we've seen cases go through the courts where people are challenging the length of their detentions. And some of these people are held in criminal prisons. And, in Canada, we've had a recent campaign to try to prevent people from being held in criminal prisons, and the campaign has successfully, turned provinces' minds around so that they don't agree to hold persons. But federal prisons are still a main site, and immigration detention holding centers are a main site for people to be basically held in cages for no other reason than just to manage the movement of that person, even if they don't have a criminal charge or conviction. And then finally, I just want to say that, Canada is very much embedded with the carceral and immigration enforcement of the United States, meaning that we are in what's called a Five Eyes arrangement with the United States and four other nations, where we share biometric, biographic intelligence that includes photos, fingerprints, and other kinds of data. This information is shared freely, and not only is information shared, but tactics are now being shared in terms of the ways in which people can be trained and taught how to use certain kinds of technology. Canada is mimicking the United States in its enforcement policy. For example, our latest budget, Prime Minister Carney increased the budget for CBSA while decreasing the budget for everything else. They have just passed a bill, Bill C-12, that has allowed the government to have power to full-scale cancel or paint an entire group of people or migrants and deny status to those people based on any grounds. And finally, they've imposed a one-year bar similar to the one that the United States have in prohibiting people from claiming refugee protection after 1 year of being within the United States. So we're seeing, not only a mimicking but cooperative engagement with the United States, and certainly with the defense of the Safe Third Country Agreement, the government is holding firm and fast to working tightly with the United States, sending people back directly to ICE. So I have much more to say about this, but I'll leave it there for now in terms of the context of what we're working with. And I just want to accentuate the fact that this is not new. We've had this kind of enforcement practice. There is experimentation with technologies, and there is a very tightly intertwined relationship with the United States and ICE in our practices.
Thank you. I think that's it, like having that context is so significant in terms of thinking about the this sort of bubbling up resistance to Canada contributing to ICE without that maybe mirror of self-reflection of what's actually happening within Canada already, and that righteous anger can be channeled in ways that aren't limited to just Canada's contributions to ICE, given that broader context, which I think is so important for folks to be mindful of. And speaking of that kind of context, I mean, placing this moment of, public backlash or public concern around Canada's tech contributions to ICE into a legal, a social, a historical, a geographic, a broader geographic context, recognizing obviously what's happened in and is continuing to happen in Canada, and then also around the world. I wonder if first, James, maybe you could speak to some of that legal context. How is it that distributing or sending weapons to contribute to very obvious violence is legal? Is it legal? How is this happening? What context do we have there to think about this through a legal lens?
Yeah. So there's a bit of a big picture answer to that and a more sort of granular answer to that. The big picture answer is just that we live in a global capitalist economic system that is explicitly designed to facilitate trade relations, economic relations, the flow of capital easily across borders, and is at the same time not designed, or perhaps more accurately, designed not to facilitate the flow of responsibility for complicity in human rights harms back across those same borders. So it's all very much by design. That's a sort of big picture, and it's important to keep that in mind. The more granular answer, or I guess there's a few things I could talk about, but the element I want to talk about or want to highlight right now uh, uh, starts with a statute called the Export and Imports Permits Act, which governs the export of, among other things, the export of Canadian military goods and technology to other countries. In the normal course, under this act, any Canadian arms company who wants to export any military goods or technology to another country has to apply for a permit from the government and receive one before they're authorized to export those goods or technology. Um, However, there is one big exception with respect to the United States. Just for some background, I think most of us probably live in Ontario, and we all know that the US and Canada have a single integrated North American auto industry with Mexico now, which means that there's one integrated supply chain. Goods may cross the border back and forth dozens of times, literally, before they're assembled in either Canada or the US or Mexico. But no matter whether they're assembled, they'll contain uh, parts that are manufactured or produced in all three of those countries, right? Um, and the same actually applies to the military industry of Canada and the US, such that Canada and the US, uh, and this is an agreement sort of like going back decades, feeding into like sort of like a broader or stemming from a broader context of you know, a series of defense cooperation agreements, but Canada and the US effectively have a single integrated North American military industry, such that the Canadian military industry is very much a part of the U.S. Military industry, and this is how a lot of weapons and a lot of military goods and technology can get to the U.S. in the hands of ICE. It's also how a lot of Canadian arms exports are going to Israel. Canada actually sends very little in terms of arms exports directly to Israel, but there are Canadian-made goods and components that go into every bit of lethal weaponry that is used in the Gaza genocide, such as the F-35, F-15, and F-16 fighter aircraft, Apache helicopters, and so on and so forth. Just recently, there was an agreement that was concluded for 50,000 mortar shells to go to the U.S. Um, that were then to be sent to Israel. So the Canadian military industry is a big part of the supply chain as well as the industrial output capacity of the U.S. military industry. This is all, and in order to facilitate this integration, Canada and the U.S. both allow military goods and technology to go back and forth across the border without the need for any permit whatsoever. So any Canadian arms exporter can simply, for most military goods and technology, can simply send it across the border if it's destined for the U.S. without the need to apply for an individual permit at all. This is all part of a broader pattern of the Canadian government failing to adequately regulate the human rights impacts of its corporations. This is particularly prevalent in the extractive industry, where Canada is sort of like a major superpower. About half of the world's mining companies roughly are headquartered in Canada, and they operate in all kinds of countries and have massive adverse human rights and environmental impacts. And it's you know what, I think I'll stop there. Stop there.
Sure, thank you. I mean, there's
Yeah.
so much there's so much to unpack from everything everyone has already said and what I imagine is ex coming up. Like there's just so many threads to untangle, which maybe goes to that bigger picture that you were talking about how things are actually structured to enable this complicity through the distribution of technology and tools and weapons without the accountability that comes back. So thank you for that. And Jason, I wonder if you can layer onto that some of that geographical context as well. I know Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East has done a lot of work and writing around Canada's distribution of weapons technology to Israel, in particular in recent years. And also, I think some discussion around, and feel free to take or leave this if it's within your wheelhouse of what you'd like to speak about, but some discussion also around how Canada's AI minister sat down with Israel's ambassador to Canada recently to talk about more integration in that technology sphere, which builds, I think, on what James has said about how the law is structured in some ways to enable that kind of connection.
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll kind of run through similarly to what I did for how I talked about ICE. I'll kind of do the same thing for Israel. So on a high level, Israel effectively uses Palestine as a testing laboratory for security technology. And I think some people may remember Lavender. There was a big 972 mag article that went viral about Lavender, which is AI that tagged Palestinians in Gaza for assassination. And that is a really good example of the kind of ways in which Israeli security tech uses Palestine to test its technology to then send abroad. So there's sort of a two-way street here. There's the fact that Israel was Canada's fourth most frequent customer for military equipment, but then there's also that Canada imports about $1 billion worth of goods every year from Israel, and a huge part of that is these different technologies that get battle tested on Palestinians. Now, when it comes to arms specifically, James can go way deeper into this stuff, but just on a broad sense, Canada has denies that it's sending arms or components to Israel. And there's a lot of back and forth between activists and researchers and the Canadian government that I won't go into, but there is research and investigations that show that goods are still flowing to Israel from Canada. So Canada did announce a pause on new permits in 2024, but they didn't cancel existing permits. Um, so when it comes to the key companies that are involved in exporting weapons and components, etc., to Israel, there's a very long list. Uh, but aerospace companies, especially those involved in the production of F-35s and their parts, like Honeywell, are a major contributor. There's explosive manufacturers like General Dynamics that send a lot of parts and explosives to Israel. And then there's surveillance tech companies in Canada like CMC Electronics or which is in Montreal, or Calian in Ottawa. So all of these companies and many more are sending weapons and components to Israel, and much of that, as we'll discuss, goes through the U.S. But there's also substantial private Canadian investment in Israeli occupation and genocide. Stephen Harper, the former prime minister, his AWZ Ventures has invested about $500 million into Israeli military tech companies. And these are companies that are deeply implicated in human rights violations. And some of the companies that AWZ invests in are basically controlled by the company like Coresight, which uses facial recognition technology, especially at like checkpoints, to target Palestinians and identify them. So that's a major contributor from Canada. And then you mentioned it, the Canada's Minister of AI, Evan Solomon, just like he's giving subsidies for companies working with ICE, he's going to Israel and in direct dialogue with uh, uh, Israel about how they can work more closely together on AI. Another key feature of Canadian complicity is the Department of National Defense recently hosted Israeli arms tech companies to demonstrate products that are used to kill Palestinians. You can read more about that from the Maple. And then you have research from the Arms Embargo Now network, which CJPME is a part of, has produced all of this research and done investigations and found that, over 400,000 bullets have been sent to Israel and other equipment, whether it be aircraft components, weapons part, communication devices, and there's over 100 flights that they've tracked shipping Canadian goods to Israel. Um, and there's all kinds of complicating factors that we'll go into and work to untangle, I'm sure, in this discussion. But one important complicating factor is this idea of dual use technologies, so things that have a civilian and military use. So Calian, which I mentioned earlier, was sending GPS antennas to Elbit, which is an Israeli defense firm, and that was allowed. Those were coming from Canada to Israel, but AEN found that they were going to the Electronic Warfare and Signal Intelligence Facility, and Calian did back away from that contract, so there's somewhat of a win there. But I think something that we're seeing in the news a lot right now, where there's a lot of movement, is the U.S. loophole, which James touched on. I'd just say that. There is a bill that's going to be voted on tomorrow. The That was put forward by Jenny Kwan. I'll talk a bit more about it later. But this is a huge piece of the puzzle when it comes to Canada profiting off of the genocide in Gaza, as well as just the regional attacks we see Israel and the U.S. committing right now in a variety of countries. So that's my sort of broad overview, I think, of Canadian business and profiting off of Israel's actions.
Thank you. I think what I'm hearing from all of this conversation is exactly what we were so interested in with this discussion is this idea that Canadian complicity in state violence, in carceral violence, isn't new and isn't limited to Minnesota. And certainly, that kind of public pushback, that righteous anger about what we've seen covered in the media is important, but needs to maybe take on this broader context and understanding. And I wonder if, Jeff, we can turn to you in terms of how we think about Canada's own history as a colonial state, as a resource economy or ecolony of the United Kingdom of France, and that colonial history here, the way in which Canada, maybe historically, but also still now very much, is using these same kinds of weapons and technologies to police Indigenous nations and land defenders, and how you maybe it's a big loaded question, but how you maybe like contextualize some of that within our own colonial borders and history here.
Yeah, thanks. So I can use my own family's history actually to tell this story because so I'm a Cayuga Nation citizen from Six Nations of the Grand River, and our community, we're among many Haudenosaunee communities on both sides of what we call the imaginary line, but the border. And originally, like Haudenosaunee territory has been in upstate New York in the Finger Lakes region since time immemorial. And still is like there's still many communities there, and there's still lots of indigenous or lots of Haudenosaunee people that go back and forth. But it was the American Revolution, as they call it, that actually expelled us from our home territories. So in popular discourse, you often hear of things like the Trail of Tears. You never hear about Washington's orders to General Sullivan and I quote, the immediate objects are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements and capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. Like that's a direct quote that's like in the American archives from Washington, their celebrated hero, to a general to basically commit genocide. And this is 1779. This is before America is even America. It was founded in the blood of my ancestors. So a lot of Haudenosaunee people died, and those that survived, we ended up across, well, a lot of different places, but my community, my ancestors, over near Six Nations of the Grand River, which is like just southwest of Toronto by about an hour and a bit. And we've been struggling with the problem of both sides of the border ever since. So strategically, the Confederacy, which is like it's literally a confederacy of six different nations, there's a strategic decision to host the council fire on both sides of the border because we couldn't trust either colonizers. We couldn't trust the British who had just betrayed us and not supported us in the war against the Americans. We couldn't trust the Americans who just literally genocided us. So we had to have our governance in order to survive, like basically continue on both sides of this line. And not only that, the Americans continuously wanted land. They continuously wanted to push into Canada. So in the War of 1812, when the Americans tried to invade Canada, and a bunch of times ever since, it was Haudenosaunee people, along with other Indigenous folks, that had to kind of choose between the lesser of two evils. Because on one hand, so-called Canadian settlers, and obviously before Canada was Canada, was still stealing our lands. We had an agreement with the British, something called the Haldeman Tracts, to secure our land for us, for our prosperity like forever. And it kept getting encroached on. Settlers would come squats. We weren't able to get rid of them. There's dodgy land deals, all that classic stuff. And these issues continue to today. And so there's a long, complicated history in Haudenosaunee culture of both resisting American encroachment, but also resisting settlers and settler colonialism in general. And at the same time, we've also seen how the kind of colonial talking into both sides of their mouth is just so common. And we see this like in the Carney era, we've seen this in every era ever since. And traditionally, or maybe not traditionally per se, but we call all American presidents town destroyers because as far as we're concerned, they all do the same thing. They all do the exact same thing they did to us. They just do it sometimes to themselves, but other times across the world. So what we've been witnessing in Gaza for so long. I see so much of that manifested in what happened to my ancestors and to my community, except the technologies and the scale and just the raw brutality of the devastation has changed. But the mechanics of effectively killing at a distance, it's like the colonial playbook, that hasn't changed, but also the counterinsurgency strategy of creating the moral and the almost like storied justification of, oh, these are actually the bad guys. They deserve the punishment. They attacked us first, therefore we're only responding. All of that stuff is like, if you just change the names around in the historical record, it's the same strategy, just the colonial playbook just repeats itself over and over and over again. And so moving to today and Canada pretending it's kind of like innocence in all this, especially in this very serious American threats to annex Canada, going all the way back to Manifest Destiny. Like when the current fascistic government, to be frankly, most of them are pretty fascistic, um, is like literally invoking notions of manifest destiny to control everyone. Like it's also like it's not even a dog whistle anymore. But the scary thing in tech is you see the same kind of iconography, the same kind of ideology, the same kind of rhetoric basically deployed by pretty much, I'd say most, if not all, mainstream tech leaders, because our foundation of modern like digital technologies are basically born out of Silicon Valley, which itself has an incredibly brutal colonial history. And so this notion of technological progress, this notion of bringing almost like the Enlightenment through technology, and this notion of like spreading tech and this technological utopia or whatever, or progress, or whatever they want to call it, the technologies we use today are still based in all these genocidal notions of stealing lands and having the ability to do so and then to justify it later. So with all that said, like this is nothing new, but this knee-jerk response in Canada to basically pretend that somehow this place is different, and it obviously is for lots of reasons, but at the same time, if Canada at the same time is pulling back on the reconciliation era, Canada is defunding a lot of Indigenous priorities under the guise of, oh, we need economic this and economic that. And so when it comes to Indigenous resistance, like it's it's absurd to me when I keep seeing, especially in tech, this notion that like American tech equal bad, Canadian tech equal good, therefore Canadian tech we should do it because and these notions of Canadian digital sovereignty is somehow defaulting to good. And I'm sitting here as an Indigenous person who's been criminalized, who has been involved in certain things over the last 10 years, that the technologies have been getting more and more and more intense in terms of surveillance, in terms of police brutality, in terms of what I would call a counterinsurgency strategy, because ultimately Canada still needs to continue its resource extraction, regardless if it's going to American markets or going to Asia or wherever. It still is constantly having to extract things from the earth, move it to a market. And how does it get there? It moves through Indigenous lands. Who's going to impose? Who's going to oppose that? Well, just look at the timeline for the last 10 years. I mean, we had Idle No More, which sounds very familiar in the current Carney administration, pushing through a lot of laws and legislation to basically undermine Canada's own laws to make it easier to do resource development. The Standing Rock era, which then led to a lot of police tactics which we're actually seeing now today deployed on American streets against the rest of American citizens. They're doing that against Indigenous people at Standing Rock. And the same people involved in learning those kind of counterinsurgency strategies came to Canada and have been teaching RCMP. RCMP has its own special unit now, the Community Industry Response Group, since rebranded as the Critical Response Unit, BC, indicating there's probably going to be Canada-wide, basically the special forces. to squash any kind of resistance. And they have been involved in pipelines, they've been involved in forestry disputes, they've been involved also in campus protests now, when students were rightfully protesting against Palestine. So the community community industry response group is there. And they're providing expertise based on their own counterinsurgency expertise from the States, based on obviously their connections to Israel. So even the connections between Canadian policing and strategies and technologies and tactics, they move across all of these borders. These people get trained in the same places. And then the foundational law in which Canada supposedly makes itself different than America gets undermined in the front lines in Indigenous struggles. So already we've seen with Sots and the erasure of civil liberties through like media like exclusion zones and journalists basically being detained for reporting. We've seen so much police brutality, which has gone completely and utterly like unchecked. Um, and so on, and for further laws to criminalize any kind of dissent, especially related to critical industry or critical infrastructure, I think it was, because like I know there's a lot that's happened in the last 5 years, but like 2020 was a very intense time for all of Canada. And this is right before COVID. And we're talking like we've got the Wet'suwet'en struggle, we've got the Fairy Creek struggle in my community, the land back lane struggle, we've got the Mi'kmaq fisheries struggle, and it led to a Canada-wide infrastructure shutdown because Canada, in terms of infrastructure, is a very thin strip. It doesn't take much to shut it down. And Canada knows it's vulnerable in that sense. And with the COVID era, a lot of that kind of momentum has stopped, but it's not gone away. And so we've seen a kind of a pause, an awkward kind of pause when it comes to Indigenous resistance to colonial extraction, but that's ramping up very quickly, especially now under the rhetoric, again, of critical resources, of especially now with what's happening in Iran and like oil, and the desperation to respond to these geopolitical problems. And now we've got the Ring of Fire, we've got so much happening. And then we've also got data centers on top of that. And data centers require an ungodly amount of electricity and water. Where's that going to come from? Whose land is that going to be on? And who's going to resist that? And so when Canada at the same time is also starting to erode Canadian civil liberty under the auspices of surveilling, quote unquote, whatever they want to call it, but ultimately it's going to be Indigenous people first, that will roll across to all Canadians. And so what we're seeing in the States, like we're not invulnerable to that. It's just a matter of time if we don't do something about this. I guess I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And I mean, for each of your contributions, there's so much to unpack, like especially here, I think even just drawing out some of these connections. And as you were speaking, I was just thinking about how it's so notable, especially in the last handful of years, how some violence is borderless and other violence is bordered or exists on the border, and just the way that technology also plays a role in maybe facilitating that, making it seamless, enabling states to enact it, enabling, private companies to enact it as well. It makes resistance so additionally complicated and layered. And I think, Jeff, where you ended there segues really well into some thinking about, for folks who are hearing this, who are listening, who are thinking about these interconnections and maybe how to channel energy or resistance. I wonder, I'd love to hear from each of the panelists, and I can kind of prompt you in turn. Just what are your thoughts in terms of where folks can maybe take next steps? Maybe James, we can start with you in terms of thinking about the law. Like, are there steps that folks can take in terms of legal reform, legal change, resistance, whatever it might be?
Yeah, sure. I'll just emphasize again what I tried to stress before, which is that the analysis has to start from the perspective that the legal system is structured to prop up our global capitalist economic system, which means that it is designed to enhance corporate power and minimize corporate accountability. And that is how it is designed to work. Um, that said, um, I I do think that there could be ways to sort of like turn some of the strengths of the global economic system against itself, and the turn the interconnectedness of the global economic system against itself. Um, because think about it, like what I said earlier about the Canadian and U.S. military industries being integrated into one single is that can you hear me? I see something. Okay. What that means is that if uh, you it may be possible to disrupt the supply chain of the U.S. military industry, which is the biggest supplier of arms to Israel. If you disrupt the flow of military goods technology from Canada to the U.S., you're disrupting this entire supply chain of the U.S. military industry, and you can do that right here from Canada, right? So take like an example like the F-35 program. Again, the F-35 is the pinnacle of fighter technology and sort of like a centerpiece of the U.S. military strategy for global military dominance. And it actually has a very international supply chain that is involves 8 partner countries. And again, it is intentionally designed this way in order to, I guess, help the U.S. commit its global allies to the F-35 program. But again, it that means that if you all it might take is just disrupting the supply chains in one place somewhere, through, it leaves it vulnerable to a coordinated global strategy to try and disrupt the supply chain in any one of those places, in any one of those 8 countries. All it might take is some kind of like victory in one place to disrupt the component. Hello?
You're
Is this
you're back.
okay? Okay. Um, so yeah, so all it might take is one victory somewhere in one place. You could disrupt the entire supply chain, potentially of one critical component. Um, and keep in mind that these F-35s that are being used so frequently to help to advance the genocide in Gaza. These are very high maintenance machines, right? It's estimated that for every hour of flying, they require 3 hours of maintenance, which requires like a constant flow of these spare parts, right? So these supply chains are actually very important in the continual operation of the entire machine. And so there's various efforts underway again to try and disrupt that. And Jason mentioned the No More Loopholes Act, Bill C, I forget the number, 242, something like that. Two,
233.
233, thank you. It's also possible so Bill C 233, like it's going to be a tough to get past, get through. Being perfectly honest, like the current government is a very trade-oriented government. He's not a human rights government. He's not opposed to human rights necessarily, but like he just doesn't really care. He's very focused on maintaining international trade, promoting Canadian history. Um, it's possible also potentially to challenge this loophole, this constitutionally, which is something that we're working on as well. Um, but I mean, it's not easy. I'm not going to lie. It's hard to do it, but I think the thing to focus on, and I think the beauty of the whole situation is that, like in theory, if um it is technically possible here sitting in Canada, which we like to think of as like a relatively insignificant country, not really very important on the global stage. But given, like in light of the arrangements that I just described, it is technically possible to disrupt the entire supply chain of the U.S. military industry just from here. And that is the thing I think the key to focus on.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful positioning. I think just in terms of thinking about how you channel your energies and especially I like your like the framing of how do we take what's structured and maybe turn it against itself if we're interested in attempting to thwart some of these complicities that we're talking about. And I wonder if we can bring Jason into that because in terms of thinking around, I mean, James, I think you're absolutely right that like this is very hard to do. Are there ways in which we can think around organizing? And I know you were thinking about the No More Loopholes Act as well. So if you want to use that as an example.
Yeah, well, I would say just to start from the No More Loopholes Act, like something that's happened today is CJPME had a lobby day in Ottawa, pushing MPs to vote in favor of Bill C2 33. Um, and as James correctly points out, it's a battle and there will be a vote tomorrow, so we'll learn more. And I think that's one type of advocacy that can be important. You know, there are legal challenges that are being pushed forward that I'm sure James could speak to more comprehensively than I could. But I would when it comes to organizing against these systems, I'll leave some of what Jeff talked about for him, and the critical response unit is such a crazy dovetail with all of this. But I would say when it comes to the pushback against ICE and the pushback against Israel, like there's so much crossover and the people doing that work. So we have human rights organizations like World Beyond War has been doing amazing work on both of these fronts and has really been a leader in building coalitions. And I think building coalitions amongst these human rights groups is really essential. And that's something that's happened, on the Palestine side. Um, we have the Arms Embargo Now campaign and a number of other coalitions that are working against these things. There are some political leaders that have stepped up. We've talked about Jenny Kwan and the No More Loopholes Act. But when it comes to ICE and calling out Canadian businesses participating in the atrocities in the US, you had the Ontario NDP leader Merritt Stiles come out and make some comments. Nikki Sharma in BC, the BC Attorney General. And while I'm generally hesitant to give politicians much credit for these things, I mean, these are important statements. They make it into the news and they have a role play. But the reason those politicians are making the statements is because of the additional advocacy that's going on. I would also say that, the investigative reporting that's happened when it comes both to ICE and Israel has been essential. Now, the CBC and the Toronto Star have done some critical reporting on this stuff and some other outlets, but really it's been like independent media outlets that I think have carried most of the water, that have given the ammunition to activists to fight back on Canadian complicity in business dealings. I'd specifically, note the Maple and the Breach have done really important work that I've come across, and that was a lot of the reading I did in anticipation of this event. It's amazing how much those small organizations were able to do. We have, activists on the ground targeting these complicit businesses. We have protests and blockades against manufacturers in Canada who are having their components go to Israel. You had protests in Montreal recently where I am against Hootsuite. And some of this stuff delivers wins. I mean, there's a company, the Jim Pattinson Developments. They backed out of a sale of a facility to ICE because of public outcry and media investigations into what was going on. As we talked about earlier, you had Calian canceled their GPS antennas that were going to go to Elbit. You have Scotiabank that recently divested from Elbit. And then you have a huge amount of other divestment going on, and all of that is possible because of this ecosystem of actors who are pushing back. And there's a role for everyone to play. I think in my experience in activism, it's amazing how like in any sector of society, there's a role that you can play. But fundamentally, as keeps coming back to, this is about fighting the systems of capitalism that enable this stuff, and not allowing ourselves to be complicit and finding a role that you can contribute to. And the government's taking notice. The Canadian Crown Corporation is reviewing its own arms exports, and most of that stuff is redacted, but CBC did have some reporting about, what that looks like internally. So there's a lot of work to be done, but I think to me, that's the general sense of how things are moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And just seeing some of those wins and successes too, I think is helpful. As small as some might be, it's really I mean, it shows that there can be this difference made, and that maybe targeting some strategic sort of business affiliations or whatever it might be can actually move things forward. Jamie, I wonder if you could speak also to, especially, I mean, if there happens to be anyone who's sort of maybe newly attuned to the border, to the violence of the border, and to the violence of immigration laws and policies and technologies. What are some ways that people might start to channel some of that energy, and in particular, resistance to some of the violence and harm and death that can come from these carceral border policies?
Yeah, thank you. We're lucky in that we have a very vibrant advocacy community in immigration and border issues. And so, one organization I would urge people to follow is the Migrant Rights Network. They are a grassroots organization that have their pulse on everything from temporary foreign workers to how people are being treated in detention. They're grassroots and involve people that are directly affected. Another grassroots organization that people can connect with is the Canadian Council for Refugees. They're an umbrella organization of hundreds of organizations that service and assist migrants. And then, more specifically on the issue of, the use of carceral tools, I would say that organizations that call for abolishing prisons or the conditions of prisons are helpful. For example, there was a recent campaign jointly with Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International that was very successful that garnered provincial agreement not to house migrants in their provincial jails. And so there is still a campaign that's working on the federal government to stop housing people in federal prisons. I would say, if you want to have more personal connections with people affected, you can volunteer with settlement organizations. You could also work with, if you're a law student, there's many legal advocacy organizations working on legal challenges as well. And I would just say one of the best things you can do is read on this issue, read the research and help debunk myths that are out there, because there's a lot of misinformation about who migrants are, why we need carceral tools to manage the movement of people. And, educate yourself is the easiest way to really help the cause and to have conversations like this. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And Jeff, I'm going to turn it to you for the last word before we open up to some Q&A. So also just a quick note to attendees, if you have a question that you'd like to share, feel free to pop it into the question box anytime. And we'll turn to those and panelists will have an opportunity to respond. But Jeff, taking everything that we've talked about, it's another big one I'm giving you, but taking what we've talked about today, I wonder if, you have suggestions and thoughts generally. And also, I mean, like the thing that keeps coming to me is like, how can settlers maybe start to recognize or think about the state of Canada, given that, a lot, as you mentioned, a lot of this started here before maybe seeing some of this violence or technology sent abroad, only to then return. And it's almost like there's been a catalyst maybe for settlers who've been privileged not to experience some of this violence. Are there ways that people can start, if they're interested, to think more broadly? And I don't want you to just speak to settlers, but to anyone who's interested in resisting here, how might we sort of better frame thinking about this righteous anger against ICE within the context of the colonial state of Canada?
Yeah, and I mean, this is an awkward moment for a lot of different reasons. Because in some ways, we're actually seeing much more manifested, like how settler colonialism, imperialism, and patriarchy, a lot of isms and things, it's not like this is a multi-headed hydra that impacts everybody, and it doesn't matter how privileged you are, eventually it's going to come to you. unless you're like the hyper super privileged, but at the same time, like they're also going to pay their bill at some point. Not that I'm endorsing anything, but the point is that choosing like when history begins is so important because any kind of narrative that chooses for you when that narrative cycle begins is a way to basically control who's the victim versus who's the perpetrator, control who is just, who is unjust, control the kind of moral high grounds. And especially in a colonial context, this is super duper important because like it forces us to have a reckoning of like what is as opposed to like what this narrative fantasy is. Now it doesn't then turn into any kind of guilt spiral or to say that like, oh, certain people were here first, therefore they're better or whatever, because then we're stuck in the same problem, right? When we're talking about immigration as an Indigenous person, it seems very simplistic to be like, oh, if we just didn't have immigration in the first place, like, but then I'm like, okay, now I'm a nationalist. Now I'm being a jerk. Like now I'm doing the same thing as my enemies. That doesn't work either, right? And like from our perspective as Anishinaabe people, like we this isn't a classic like, oh, we don't own the land, therefore anyone can come here. But it's like we all have a responsibility to steward these lands and take our responsibility of this seriously so that we have the right to be here. And part of that is having that responsibility to understand like what is actually happening here. And in the sense of like like James identified it perfectly in terms of like understanding like the lever points is so important. And if we understand that in the larger global context, obviously we're in the oil wars, but at the same time we're also in the quote unquote critical mineral era. What does that actually mean? Well, it's not just for the quote unquote energy transition, which is itself potentially another problematic thing, but geopolitically, a lot of the particular resources that American imperialism requires for all of its munitions, a lot of them come from China. And the imperial endgame is to not be reliant on China. And so, like, they're pretty explicit in America right now about like the domination of the Western Hemisphere. Again, going back to Manifest Destiny, taking over the entire continent. And so, when America is like blatantly threatening to annex Canada, because it's not that this isn't new, like stuff isn't new. It's just Trump is very like he has no mask. You know what I mean? But the point is when we're talking about things like Bill, I'm so bad with all these bills. There's so many bills. Like Bill C5, Bill 5, like Ford's whole thing about like the Ring of Fire and all that. Like all of these projects, every time you're hearing like critical minerals, what are these minerals used for? Where are they going? Why do we need to extract them in the first place? And a lot of them are currently in locations that are very difficult to access. And so, what do you start with? You start with roads. Oh, what is Ontario doing right now? Oh, it's fast tracking a lot of roads. Whose territory do those roads go to? Oh, it turns out that a lot of Indigenous people who've been dispossessed by their from their original territories and now been placed in the quote unquote undesirable lands. Oh, that land is now desirable and we need access to it. So we're going to build you roads. Why don't you want roads? Don't you want progress? Don't you want this? Don't you like it's a lure, it's a trap because they don't give, I'm trying not to swear, they don't care about Indigenous people in that sense. They're trying to, the nebulous they, but like it's pretty obvious what the play is here. And so when it comes to those lever points, understanding the raw resource requirements of both imperialism, colonialism, and all these kinds of things is so important, but also where are they? Because Canada's not going to come right out and say, oh, by the way, our American friends, their entire war machine will collapse if we don't get the Ring of Fire minerals. I mean, they'll kind of say that, but like that's one point of contention. And so the problem is who's going to resist that? How are they being supported? How are they being actually like, are they just going to be like, oh, well, now that this is a matter of us, now we're going to give you a bit of money? At the same time, when Canada is increasing its surveillance laws through things like its lawful access provisions and stuff like that, that hits harder against communities that are already underserved and underprivileged and overexploited because they don't have the luxury to know how to do anti-surveillance. They don't have the luxury to get off Facebook. They don't have the necessary luxury to choose when to not be surveilled. They got to do what they got to do. And so there's still like a material resource disadvantage in terms of the actual people on the front line being sacrificed for this. And so, if we're going to take this seriously of resisting all this, we also have to take into account the actual sacrifice zones. Is being sacrificed here, and how can we support them as human beings? And so, because at the end of the day, like this, we're seeing this massive manifestation of killing at a distance and the material requirements for that. Like they're gonna run out of bombs. And where are they going to resupply all this stuff? Well, it's not even bombs now, it's also drones. As you know, drones require a lot of batteries. And these are one-way weapon deployments, aka kamikaze, aka they're just going there and they're exploding. That material is gone. And so Canada will be talking about, oh, we need electrification for our cars and blah, blah, blah. Like, are those batteries really going to our cars? Do we even need those cars in the first place? Where exactly are they going? Are they going to end up in a drone that's going to be deployed maybe here in Canada against a land defender? Hasn't happened yet, but we're already being surveilled. All of these technologies are already being tested here as well. You're not necessarily hearing about it because these are happening in quote unquote remote places. And then also now with the exclusion zones and stopping journalists from doing their jobs here, and then also control of the infrastructure of the internet and who can actually do these things. It's very difficult. So, I mean, a classic kind of like organizing principle is like this notion of we keep us safe. And we have to take that seriously in terms of building community of supports, building community of care, building community of basic logistics, of feeding people, of making sure that if they are getting criminalized, that they have the resources to survive and keep going. This means jail support. This means like a lot of things that Indigenous folks and Black folks have been dealing with from day one and know a lot more about this than some random Canadian that this is the first time they feel nervous about whatever. So the point is, a lot of these structures already exist. There are just a lot of them are underfunded, and a lot of them are under extreme threat of a lot more oppression coming. And so we don't necessarily have to build new networks. We just have to tap into a lot of communities that already exist. And again, resourcing, like this is everything. And part of the play will also be to try to restrict that resourcing, to try to make it criminal to fund frontline work, to try to make it criminal to do any kind of like GoFundMe's or what have you. And because again, if they also are going to be cutting off our material needs to resist. And then, of course, like direct action gets the goods. Like, I'm not going to advocate for anything, obviously, on a public Zoom call. But at the end of the day, like, things have to get done. And this requires decentralized organizing. This requires what fellow panelists have said about basically finding what you're already good at and just doing more of that. This doesn't necessarily mean like everyone has to be at the blockade. Like for every person at a blockade, you need people cooking, you need people getting supplies, you need people running phone calls, you need people driving people around, you need people doing a lot of logistics work. And we're seeing that. We saw that a lot in Minnesota. But we see that in Los Angeles. We see that in a lot of communities that are already criminalized for a very long time have already built these networks of care that don't depend on a state to save them because the state's not coming. The state is often the problem. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that before I say more that I shouldn't say.
I mean, I think, obviously everything that we're talking about is intense and complex and has multiple layers, but I feel like you left us on a hopeful note of, like these communities and networks of care do exist. And it's not a matter of people jumping in and reinventing the wheel, but of getting tapped into what's your role? How do you contribute? I think what I've heard from you all, like this has been such a fantastic discussion that I could easily sit and listen to you all for like 2 more hours. I won't ask you to do that, but I could I could sit and listen and learn from you. But I think something that really jumps out and that I think we were interested in organizing this conversation is the way that, if your sensation is, I am upset about Canada's contributions to ICE and what I'm seeing in Minnesota and what I'm seeing elsewhere in the United States, it doesn't mean that's the only avenue for response, for resistance, for bringing more care. And what I've heard from you all are ways in which you can support, passing of laws or support legal actions against certain conduct or certain state permissions. You can join abolitionist groups that seek to eliminate imprisonment of people who are moving around the world solely because of movement. You can resist mineral extractions in Ontario as a part of the bigger thinking about, your concerns around ice. Hopefully, I'm not putting too many words in anyone's mouths and this all sounds okay, but I just think that there's so much generative information here in terms of ways in which, anyone can find a way to engage and a way to respond and react to some of what's been happening, even if the media and public attention has really focused on like a couple of Canadian companies are contributing to ice. It can be really helpful, as Jeff said, to reconsider where history starts and to think about maybe the bigger picture of where each of us can find our niche, to maybe take some kind of steps or actions. So with that, I just want to say another enormous thank you. We don't have like a live group, so I'm just going to applaud for you on behalf of everyone to say thank you for your contributions. And we do have time for question and answer. I can see a couple of questions coming in. Cynthia, I don't know if you want to jump on and participate in the narration of the question and answer. There you are. But I can turn it over to you now, Cynthia, if you'd like to take the lead on that.
Sure, we have a couple questions, and also I think we'll have room for more. So if you have something on your mind, don't be afraid to submit a question, and I will start going through them. So the first one is considering OpenAI's connections to the Trump administration and targeting of the trans community. Should we be talking about more than just an apology for a warning that didn't go to authorities? So I think we haven't really touched on this on the panel yet, but I imagine this is referring to what happened with the Tumbler Ridge shooting and the news coverage that recently Evan Solomon has met with OpenAI. OpenAI has apologized, but given OpenAI's connections to the Trump administration, I think their broader violent anti-trans project, I guess the question is, we be asking more of OpenAI than a mere apology? So anyone can take this.
I guess I can jump in real quick. I mean, I've heard apologies so many times through, the whole reconciliation era that it's just like it's a joke. And there has to be a structural response. Like Cynthia, like in your thread, you detail a lot of this. You probably answer this better than I can, but this knee-jerk reaction to, oh, this horrible thing has happened, we quote have to do something about it. Well, often the thing that is going to be quote done about it is what's already been planned to be done anyway. It's just they need the narrative cover. So right now, in the larger context, again, from my perspective of counterinsurgency strategy, there is already the groundwork for a lot of surveillance laws and erosion of civil liberties to be happening. And so something like this, especially involving children, involving minors, is often a very strong narrative hook to get people to often volunteer to have their civil liberties reduced in the name of a larger quote unquote justice problem. But the question is like, is that even the right solution? So if we undermine our civil liberties in response to this, is that the right call? Like, I don't know, Cynthia, you want to jump in on there? I can throw this back to you and join the panel.
Thanks for that. I definitely don't want to take away from the panelists. Is there anyone else who would like to add on? James?
I do have a few thoughts, but I would actually, I echo Jeff. I would like to hear from you, Cynthia.
Okay, I will say one sentence and then link to the thread that I wrote about on Blue Sky, which is that I'm worried that the government will use the focus on whether they reported on or not reported to police and pass a bunch of lawful access legislation that will force them to report to police and then be like, see, we did something about AI companies while not passing actual AI regulations, is the core of it.
Yeah, I mean that's basically it. Like I think it's a distraction from what the real danger of companies like OpenAI is. I'll add parenthetically that OpenAI is alleged to also be one of the companies, along with through Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, which are contributing their technology to the genocide in Gaza. And it's such an incredibly sort of dangerous sort of technology, so a bit of personal background. Like I was originally in my undergrad, I was at a computer science major with a minor in cognitive science, and I was you know my interest was in AI, and I just like I just there was a t after a while I couldn't anymore because like every research paper I read was like, oh, we'd like to greatly acknowledge the support of the CIA or the NSA or the like U.S. Armed Forces, whatever, right? Like, and I after some point I just couldn't do it anymore. And this is 20 years ago, by the way, right? And it's only accelerated since then. And so like I think there's something about like I think the Holocaust. I think there's something so what makes it so qualitative, or one of the things that makes so qualitatively different is that it's possibly the world's first sort of like industrialized genocide on that scale. And like I think what the same way what makes the Gaza genocide stand out is it may be the world's first one of the world's first like AI powered genocides. So yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's just it's really scratching the surface. It's really the tip of the iceberg of like what needs to be done. And I don't know if there are any easier answers to it either. But yeah, a lot more needs to be done to sort of uh uh regulate some of the potential dangers of AI, which are enormous.
I do want to say one thing quickly in response to that. It's tricky because it's like when are we talking about AI? Are we talking about algorithmically driven decision? Are we talking about like creating like a machine that creates like an excuse for bureaucrats to like do whatever? Um, so like in the Canadian context, so like of the ongoing genocide against Indigenous peoples, a lot of it is highly bureaucratic. A lot of it is very much about removing funding. A lot of it is very much about certain funding models that have been made under God knows who for how long. And a lot of this kind of like distance decision making that now is becoming further and further abstracted through these technologies. So obviously, like it's different in the sense that the Canadian government isn't using a tool to select targets to then deploy missiles and blow things up yet, I hope. But like definitely, if you know anything about, but like um, uh, how the Canadian government does funding, especially for Indigenous peoples. Like it's I agree that it's new in certain kinds of forms of the technology, but the spirits of removing that kind of accountability, but also at the same time creating this distance between like the subject to be basically exploited or eliminated or removed, and this highly bureaucratic, like, oh, we need this system to save us time because it's too expensive to do the murdering in person. So we have to do it bureaucratically. And that's often what a lot of these technologies can effectively do is distance the operator from the decision, make the machine ultimately the decision maker, so to speak, and thus cannot be held accountable. Because it's like, oh, we either meant to bomb a girls' school, which is horrible, or oh, the machine told us that it was a legitimate target and it was a mistake, which is horrible. Whose fault is it? And so that kind of dodging of responsibility has been in Canada in the colonial context from day one, in terms of just removing, oh, that I, as a bureaucrat, 5872, I made like you, the previous bureaucrat made a deal with you. Like, it's not my problem. And I have a documentation, a system, and bureaucracy that says it's fine. Sorry, I'm going on a tangent here.
No, there's so many interconnected topics that I think we're always just like on the cusp of a tangent that's still very much relevant. So the next question, the Canadian government has an AI suppliers list of vetted companies. Palantir has been on this list since its inception in 2019. Can we find ways to remove companies from this preferred vendors list? So I guess kind of a procurement, tech regulation, supply chain question. And if you have thoughts related to this, even if it's not about the specific suppliers list, then
I do want to say one thing in relation to this. Like Cohere is currently Canada's big darling for data centers for AI, blah, blah, blah. Like Canada is very much just like, oh, we need to pick like one company, throw a bunch of money at it, and that will be like the Canadian version of whatever. Meanwhile, like Cohere literally is like working like with Palantir. Like, and often even when you're building, like I myself am not a software developer, but I know enough in my relation to software development that it's just like often your company's software is usually reliant on a bunch of other companies' software. And it's pretty rare for you to own and control the entire stack unless you're like Apple. So even if you're a quote unquote Canadian company, a quote unquote Canadian vendor, chances are through either subcontracts or through the actual deployment of the technology itself, you're probably using some other company's tech. So for example, even Palantir is using Anthropic's Claude as part of their targeting system. And that's why in the States, they're like, oh no, we have to stop Claude because blah, 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 and we're going to replace it with Grok. But then they're saying, oh yeah, we've removed them from the vendors list. They're now an evil, like I can't remember the terminology. They're still using it because you can't just strip out Claude and then add something in. And it's too valuable for them. So like, yeah, I don't know the answer to this.
Cynthia,
You're on
you're
mute,
muted
Cynthia.
there.
Sorry, I was asking if anyone had any other thoughts. If not, okay, I can move on to the next question, which is, what is one of the most unexpected things you've seen or experienced when organizing or resisting? And I think maybe I'll add a spin to that, which is maybe something that was particularly beyond the pale, although that could take us to a dark place quickly, or in the other direction, maybe an unexpected victory or something where a campaign didn't seem like it would go the right way, but then, there was a last minute surprise champion or things turned out better than even expected.
Maybe I'll just pipe in really quickly to say that I think, getting involved in, Jeff had mentioned like something as small as just even, visiting someone in prison or attending with someone who's going to prison or driving someone to prison or in my field, sometimes it's like going, to a settlement office and helping people, figure out, certain resources, how to find information. And I think, those kinds of experiences are really humanizing. And one of the things that we forget in these conversations is how all of this technology and these processes are meant to provide distance between the people making decisions and the people that it ultimately affects. And so for us as well, when we're in, the advocacy space, it is easy also to forget who are behind the causes that we care about, and to remember that there are people behind the scenes, and it will surprise you how it really will make your experience a little bit more, I would say, enlightened, in the sense that you might be surprised that you might change your mind in terms of the tactics, the strategies that you think are useful as an expert in this field, or you might have a certain predetermined idea about how things should be organized. But when you're interacting with the people who it affects the most, it can be quite moving to learn from them. And I would encourage people, if you're new to this space, to just take up, the opportunities to work in those spaces, because I think it's important to always have that link or to the community that it mostly affects.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll just jump in to say, for the last 3 years, I've just been like deeply immersed in media work and media advocacy. So I'll speak to that a little bit. And I think what has surprised me in my work, and this really relates to a lot of our conversation, is just how much power the media has in the West in general, and yet how captured our media establishments are by capital and by the interests of power. And it's such a shame that such powerful institutions are just so full of like self-deluded people um, who are in these positions of power within the media because they've undergone this training and all these layers of filtering um, to ensure that when they get to that position of power where they're supposed to hold power to account and do all of these things, it so rarely happens. And there's a handful of champions in this country who are doing important work at these huge institutions. And then you have independent media outlets doing some very important work. Um, but when media get things right, when we do manage to like break the ice a little bit and some truth seeps out, it's incredible the reactions you get from the government. Like the statements from Anita Anand as all of this information is getting reported by CBC about how Canada is arming Israel's genocide, like that back and forth, it was things were moving so fast. Um, so I would just say what's cool about media activism and what's surprising about it is when the moments where you do break through, it's like it's an avalanche. Like things just start to happen really fast. Like the moment the media actually gets things right and reports on things honestly and truthfully, um, a lot happens at the government level because I think fundamentally with all of these struggles it's just like if ordinary people understood the ways in which they were complicit I think they would be really pissed off and that's been one use function of like social media when it comes to Palestine that I've seen is like it's a live streamed genocide and a lot of people are pissed off and the if you look at the approval rates of the war in Iran, whether in Canada or the US and the polls, like it's very unpopular, and that's pretty unusual. But I think it's because people have been conditioned for the last 3 years to start to actually be skeptical of these things. Like large numbers of people are increasingly skeptical of these things. So anyway, I don't know, that's not an entirely clear answer, but just a little bit of what I experienced doing media activism specifically.
That's a great answer. Thank you. And I feel like so much of the past couple of years can be laid at the feet of failures of the fourth estate. It actually is nice to hear it does still hew to the core principles of what it's supposed to mean and what that it can be effective when it does. Okay, you all had impeccable timing. We're just at the end. I'm gonna bat it back to Kristen for closing.
Yeah, thank you. And I feel like that's also kind of a optimistic note to end it on. And I don't know if you meant this as a pun, but break the ice was a great little inclusion there in your answer, Jason. So I just want to say thank you again. Thank you to all of the attendees who came. This will be made available if you know folks who were interested but couldn't join. We'll make sure to get the recording and other materials and things that might be helpful out. But an enormous thank you to all of the panelists, to your time, to your commitment to having this conversation. I really appreciate it. I know we all do. And thank you to everyone who helped to organize this panel. It's been a really generative conversation, and I really appreciate it. And there's going to be a lot more thinking going on from here, and hopefully maybe some more collaboration as well. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Does anyone want to add to that?